I was just sitting at the kitchen table one morning, holding that old watch in my hand, turning it over and over the way I always did when something was bothering me, when my nephew Marcus walked in and said the words that would change everything. He looked at me with that easy smile of his and said, "Uncle Ray, why do you still have that old junk?" I looked up at him. I did not say anything right away. I just held the watch a little tighter. That is the moment this whole story starts. Not the moment at the jewelry store when the man behind the counter looked at the number engraved on the caseback and said it out loud in a voice that made 3 other customers stop what they were doing and turn around. Not the moment my nephew turned pale. Not the moment I had to make a decision about what kind of man I wanted to be. It started right there, at my kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold and an old watch in my hand. This is that story, and I promise you, by the time we get to the end of it, you will feel something. You might feel angry, you might feel surprised. You might even feel a little bit of what I felt when everything came together and I finally understood what that watch really meant. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, have you ever found something that someone else called worthless and turned out it was the most valuable thing in the room? Just type yes or no below. I read every single comment. Let me back up and tell you who I am, because the story does not make sense without that part. My name is Raymond. Most people call me Ray. I am 68 years old. I have lived in the same house for 31 years, a 2-story house on a quiet street with a big oak tree in the front yard that my wife Dora always said was the reason she agreed to move there in the first place. She loved that tree. I love it because she loved it. That is how it works when you are married to someone for 41 years. I retired from the post office about 3 years ago. I spent 32 years as a mail carrier and then the last few years working in the sorting facility when my knees started talking to me too loud to ignore. I do not miss the work exactly, but I miss the routine. I miss having a reason to get up at 5 in the morning. These days I make my own reasons, and one of them is that watch. Every morning I would take it off the nightstand where it sat next to a photograph of my father, and I would hold it for a minute before I put it on. It was a ritual. My father started it and I continued it. The watch belonged to him. He wore it every day of his adult life. When he passed, 17 years ago now, he left it to me. It was not a flashy watch. That is the thing. It was not the kind of thing that made people stop and stare. It had a simple round face, cream-colored with black numbers. The case was gold-toned, or so I always figured, but it was worn in places where the gold had rubbed away and you could see something darker underneath. The leather strap had been replaced twice. The second replacement strap was the one on it now, dark brown and soft with wear. My father wore this watch when he worked at the factory. He wore it when he walked me to school. He wore it at my wedding. He wore it every day until the year before he died when his wrist got too thin to hold it in place anymore. At that point, he put it on the nightstand, and there it stayed until he passed. And then it came to me. I never thought about what it was worth. It never crossed my mind. It was my father's watch. That was what it was worth. That was all it needed to be. My nephew Marcus is 26. He is my younger brother Kenneth's son. Kenneth and I have always been close, but in recent years that closeness has been complicated by distance. Not physical distance, but the kind of distance that comes when 2 people see the world differently. Kenneth has done well for himself financially, very well, and somewhere along the way that success changed him in ways I do not entirely understand. Or maybe it revealed things about him that were always there. I do not know. I try not to judge my brother. Marcus grew up in that world of comfort and ease. He is not a bad young man. I want to be fair to him. He is not mean or cruel. He is just careless. He moves through the world as if things only have value if someone tells him the price. If something does not have a tag on it, he does not know how to see it. He was staying with me that week because Kenneth and his wife were traveling for their anniversary, and Marcus's apartment was being fumigated, some kind of pest problem. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just 4 or 5 days. I told him he was welcome. Dora and I had the space, and I figured it would be nice to have some company. Dora had been visiting her sister in another state, so it was just me and Marcus rattling around in that house. The first 2 days were fine. Marcus slept late, ate whatever he wanted from the refrigerator, and spent most of his time on his phone. That did not bother me. Young people live differently than I do. I cooked dinner both nights, and we ate together at the table and had decent conversations. He asked about my years at the post office. I asked about his job, something to do with social media marketing, something I barely understand. We got along. The third day was when things started to shift. I was in my study that morning looking over some papers when I heard Marcus in the kitchen moving things around. I thought he was making breakfast, which was fine. Then I heard a sound I did not expect. It was the sound of a trash bag being tied. I walked to the kitchen. Marcus was standing by the back door with a large black trash bag in one hand and a cardboard box under his other arm. He saw me and smiled, perfectly comfortable. He said, "Morning, Uncle Ray. I hope you do not mind, I was just helping out a little." The kitchen counter was looking cluttered, so I cleared some stuff off. I looked at the counter. It was clean in a way it had not been before, but there were things missing. A small ceramic bowl where I kept random items. A wooden holder where I put mail. And I noticed right away that the space near the coffee maker, where I usually set the watch when I came downstairs in the morning before I put it on properly, was empty. My stomach went cold. I said, "Marcus, where is the watch?" He blinked. He said, "The old watch, the broken one." I said, "It is not broken." He looked a little confused now and a little uncomfortable. He said, "I thought it was. The second hand was not moving. I figured it was just an old broken watch and you had it sitting there out of habit or something. I tossed it." I said, "You tossed it." He said, "In the bag. Sorry, Uncle Ray, I did not know it meant something to you. I can dig it out." He opened the trash bag right there on the kitchen floor. He dug through coffee grounds and paper towels and an empty milk carton until he found it, wrapped in an old newspaper. He held it up. It looked small and ordinary in his hand. He handed it back to me. He said, "I really am sorry. I just thought it was junk." I took the watch. I turned it over. It was fine. No scratches, no new damage, just the same worn, quiet, familiar face. I said, "This was your great-grandfather's watch." Marcus looked at it again, differently this time. He said, "Oh, I did not know that." I said, "I know you did not." And that was the end of that conversation, at least on the surface. I went back to my study. I held the watch for a long time. I noticed that Marcus was right about one thing. The second hand was not moving. I had not noticed that before. The watch had been running a little slow recently, I thought, but I had not paid close attention. Pause. Now here is the thing about that watch. I want you to understand where my mind was at this point. I was not thinking about money. I was not thinking about value in any material sense. I was thinking about my father. I was thinking about the way he would wind that watch every morning, standing at the bathroom mirror, 3 careful turns of the crown. I was thinking about his hands, big hands, working man's hands, and the way the watch looked on his wrist. That is what I was thinking about when I decided to take it to get repaired. There was a watch repair shop about 15 minutes from my house, a small place run by a man named Harold. I had been in there once before, years ago, to get Dora's anniversary watch serviced. I remembered Harold as a quiet, careful man who wore magnifying glasses on a headband and spoke about watch mechanisms the way some people talk about music, with obvious love. I drove over the next morning, leaving Marcus asleep on the couch. It was a Tuesday. The shop was quiet when I walked in. Harold was at his bench in the back, working on something under a bright lamp. He looked up when the bell over the door rang. He said, "Good morning. What can I do for you?" I set the watch on the glass counter. I said, "It stopped. I think it needs servicing. Maybe a new battery, or maybe it is mechanical. I am not sure." Harold picked it up. He put on his magnifying headband. He turned the watch over in his hands with that careful, practiced motion that people develop when they spend decades handling small, precise things. He looked at the face, he looked at the case, then he turned it over. And he went very still. That stillness was the first thing I noticed. Harold was a man of steady movements, consistent and measured. But when he turned that watch over and looked at the back, he stopped moving entirely for several seconds. I said, "Is something wrong?" He did not answer right away. He set the watch down on a piece of clean cloth on the counter. He reached under the counter and came up with a different magnifying glass, a handheld one with a stronger lens. He looked at the case back through that lens. Then he took a slow breath. He said, "Sir, where did you get this watch?" I said, "It was my father's. He left it to me when he passed." Harold set the magnifying glass down. He looked at me over the top of his regular glasses. He said, "And before your father, do you know where he got it?" I said, "I always assumed he bought it. He never told me otherwise." Harold said, "I need to make a call before I say anything more. Would you mind waiting? It will not take long." I said that was fine. I sat down in the small chair they had in the corner for customers. Harold went to the back of the shop. I could hear him on the phone, but not the words. He was on for about 6 minutes. Then he came back. He said, "I am sorry to keep you waiting. I want to be honest with you. I am not going to tell you anything definitive today because that is not my place and I do not want to steer you wrong. But I will tell you this. I think you should take this watch to a full auction house or a specialist appraiser before you do anything else with it. I can give you the name of someone I trust." I said, "Harold, can you tell me why? What did you see?" Harold paused. He chose his words carefully. He said, "The engravings on the caseback, the serial number, the hallmarks. If they are what I think they are, this is not an ordinary watch. This could be something significant, but I am a repairman, not an appraiser. I am not qualified to tell you what significant means in terms of value. That is why I want you to see someone who is." He wrote down a name on a small card, Thomas Bellamy, at an address about 40 minutes away. He said Thomas was the best watch appraiser he knew and that I should call ahead. I thanked Harold. I picked up the watch. I drove home. Pause. That night at dinner, I did not tell Marcus what Harold had said. I was not sure why. Part of it was that I did not know anything definitive yet, and I did not want to make a big thing out of nothing. Part of it was something else I could not quite name, a feeling like I needed to hold this close for a while, like it was not ready to be shared. Marcus was in a good mood. He had spent the day somewhere, a friend's place I think, and he came back energized and talkative. He made pasta, which was a surprise, and it was actually good. We sat at the table and he talked about a project he was working on, something about building a social media following for a new client. He was enthusiastic about it, and I listened and asked questions because that is what you do. That is what being family means. At one point he said, "Hey, about that watch, Uncle Ray, I really am sorry. I should have asked before throwing anything away." I said, "It is okay, Marcus. You did not know." He said, "Was it really your great-grandfather's?" I said, "My father's, your great-uncle." He nodded. He said, "I never met him." I said, "He died before you were old enough to remember him. But he was a good man. He worked hard his whole life. He never complained about hard times, and there were hard times. He just kept going." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The watch is kind of beat up. It is not like it looks worth anything." I looked at him. I said, "Some things that look worn are worn because they were loved. That is not the same as worthless." Marcus nodded like he was hearing the words, but not entirely sure what to do with them. I went to bed that night thinking about my father. I thought about the factory where he worked, a machine parts manufacturer where he spent 28 years. I thought about how he dressed for work, how he dressed for church, how he dressed differently but always had that watch on his wrist either way. I thought about the one time I asked him where the watch came from and he smiled and said, "It came from a time when I made a good choice." He never explained what that meant. I had always assumed it was just a thing people said. That night I started to wonder if it was something more. The next morning I called Thomas Bellamy. He had an appointment open on Friday. I took it. Pause. I did not tell Marcus I was going. On Friday morning I waited until he was still asleep, which was not hard since he rarely woke before 10, and I drove to the address Harold had given me. It was in a part of town I did not know well, a block of storefronts that had been there for a long time, the kind of block where you could feel the history in the brickwork. Thomas Bellamy's shop was narrow but deep, with a wooden sign above the door that said simply Bellamy and Associates, horological specialists. I did not know what horological meant. I know now. It means related to the study and measurement of time. Clocks and watches, that is their whole world. Inside it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional, like the room itself is paying attention. There were glass cases along both walls displaying watches, some clearly antique, some modern. A young woman at a front desk greeted me and took me to a SM. All consultation room, clean and well lit, with a table and 2 chairs. Thomas Bellamy came in a few minutes later. He was maybe 70, thin and precise in his movements, with white hair cut very short and eyes that had the focused, calm look of someone who has spent decades looking at tiny things very carefully. He shook my hand and sat down across from me. He said, "You have something you would like me to look at." I put the watch on the table. He looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then he picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at the caseback. He put it under a magnifying lamp on the table. I watched his face. His face did not change much, but his breathing changed, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. He examined the watch for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word. He had a small tool kit with him, and he used it to open the case back with practiced care. He looked at the movement inside, which is the mechanical heart of a watch, the tiny gears and springs that make it run. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the case back. He set the watch down on the cloth. He laced his fingers together on the table and looked at me directly. He said, "Mr. Raymond, I want to ask you some questions before I share my assessment, if that is all right." I said, "Of course." He said, "You mentioned this was your father's watch. Do you know anything at all about its history before him? Any stories, any documents, any receipts or certificates?" I said, "Nothing. My father was not a man who kept many papers. When we cleaned out his house after he passed, we found very little in the way of documents. The watch was just there on the nightstand." Thomas said, "And your father worked at a factory, you said on the phone." I said, "A machine parts factory. He started there when he was about 19. He left in his late 40s when the factory closed." Thomas nodded slowly. He said, "Do you know if he ever traveled for work, or if he had any connections outside of his immediate work environment? Connections with people of means, collectors, traders, that sort of thing?" I said, "Not that I knew of. He was a private man in many ways." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Raymond, I am going to read you a number. This is the serial number engraved on the caseback of this watch, and I want you to tell me if it means anything to you." He read the number. It did not mean anything to me. I told him so. He said, "I did not expect it to, but that number means a great deal to me, professionally speaking, and I believe it will mean a great deal to you soon." He paused. He made sure I was ready. Then he told me what the watch was. Pause. I want to describe what happened in that room as accurately as I can, because the moment Thomas Bellamy told me what that watch was, something shifted inside me that I have not been able to fully describe to anyone since, not even to Dora when I told her the story later. He explained it to me carefully, in steps, the way a good doctor explains a diagnosis. He did not rush. He did not perform. He just laid out the facts with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of expertise. He said the watch was a piece made in Switzerland in the early 1950s by a manufacturer whose name I will not repeat exactly here, because Thomas later confirmed that using specific manufacturer names could draw unwanted attention before matters were settled. But he told me it was a company whose timepieces from that era are considered among the most significant in the watch collecting world. He said the movement inside was exceptional, a particular caliber that the company only produced for a limited run. He said the condition of the movement, despite the worn exterior, was extraordinary. Someone had kept this watch maintained internally even as the outside aged naturally. And then he said the number again, the serial number, and he explained what it meant. He said that watches from this specific run, this specific caliber, with serial numbers in this particular range, were produced in extremely small quantities. He said that in the last decade, the few examples that had surfaced at major auction houses had sold for amounts that made me sit back in my chair. He said, "I am not making a final determination today. That would require full authentication, documentation review, and formal appraisal by a certified body. But based on what I see here, my professional opinion is that this watch, your father's watch, is worth somewhere between $150,000 and potentially over $300,000. The room was very quiet after he said that. I heard the number, I heard it clearly, but it did not feel real yet. It felt like a number from a different life, from someone else's story. I said, "Are you certain?" He said, "I am certain enough to recommend immediate professional authentication. I am certain enough to tell you to keep this watch in a very safe place till that process is complete, and I am certain enough to tell you that the man who raised you may have possessed something extraordinary without ever knowing it, or knowing it very well and simply never speaking of it." That last line was the one that hit me, because I suddenly remembered what my father had said all those years ago when I asked him where the watch came from. He said, "It came from a time when I made a good choice." Pause. I drove home slowly. I held the watch in my jacket pocket and felt its weight against my ribs the whole drive. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other pressed lightly against my chest where the watch was. My father, a factory worker, a quiet, steady, uncomplicated man, or so I had always believed. And here was this watch. This watch that might have been extraordinary all along, sitting on a nightstand, worn every day, treated like a tool, like a companion, like something ordinary. Because to him, maybe it was. Because to him, it was not about the price. To him, it was about whatever choice he had made, whatever moment it came from, that he was proud of or at least at peace with. I thought about all the years I had worn it without knowing. All the mornings I had wound it or checked its time. All the moments it had been present for in my life, my daughter's graduation, my son's wedding, the morning Dora came home from the hospital after her surgery and I was standing on the porch waiting for her. The watch was there for all of it, just a watch, just my father's watch. And then I thought about Marcus. I thought about his hand reaching into that trash bag. I thought about the newspaper wrapping it. I thought about him calling it junk. And here is what I want you to understand, because this is the part of the story where a lot of people would say they would have handled things differently, and maybe they are right. When I thought about Marcus and the trash bag, I did not feel rage. I want to be honest about that. I felt something, definitely. A slow, low heat, something between frustration and sadness, but not rage. Because Marcus did not know. He genuinely did not know. And you cannot be truly angry at someone for not seeing something they had no way of seeing. What I felt when I was honest with myself, sitting in my driveway before I went inside, was something more like loneliness. Like I had been the only one who saw the value in something for my whole life, and now that value had been confirmed in a way I could not have imagined. And there was no one to tell it to except a nephew who would probably not fully understand and a wife who was 2 states away. I went inside. Marcus was awake, watching something on his laptop at the kitchen table. He looked up. He said, "Hey, Uncle Ray, you went somewhere this morning." I said I had an appointment. He said, "Everything okay?" I looked at him. I said, "Everything is fine. I'm going to make some calls this afternoon, so I might be a little unavailable. Help yourself to whatever is in the kitchen." He nodded. He went back to his laptop. I went upstairs. I put the watch in the drawer of my nightstand under some papers. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I called Dora. Pause. Dora answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring. I have never been able to explain why, but she almost never picks up immediately, and she almost never lets it go to 3 rings. 2 rings every time. She said, "Ray, is everything all right?" I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a minute without interrupting." She said, "That does not sound good." I said, "It is not bad. It is just a lot, so please just listen." And then I told her everything. The repair shop, Thomas Bellamy, the number Thomas said out loud in that quiet room. When I finished, Dora was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Raymond, are you sitting down?" I said, "I am." She said, "Because I need to be sitting down. Hold on." I heard movement. Then she said, "Okay, I am sitting. Now say that number again." I said it again. She was quiet for a few more seconds. Then she said, "Oh, my Lord." I said, "I know." She said, "Your father." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you have any idea how he got it?" I said, "That is what I keep thinking about." We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon. We talked about my father, about what we remembered of him, about the stories he had and had not told us. We talked about who he had been as a young man, before Dora knew him, back in the years before he met my mother. We talked about what it might mean. And somewhere in that conversation, Dora said something that opened a door I had not thought to open. She said, "Ray, did you ever go through all those boxes from your father's house? The ones in the garage?" I said, "I looked through most of them." She said, "But not all of them." I said, "There might be 1 or 2 I never got through." She said, "I think you need to go look, tonight if he kept any papers at all about where that watch came from. They would be in those boxes." She was right. She is usually right. That is one of the things about 41 years with the same person. You stop arguing about who is right eventually because you figure out that when one of you is certain about something, it is worth listening. Pause. The garage. I want to tell you about those boxes because going through them that evening was one of the strangest and most moving hours of my life. Marcus helped me after I explained that I was looking for old papers from my father's house. He was genuinely helpful, actually. He moved boxes around without being asked, and he did not complain about the dust. There were 7 boxes total in the corner behind the lawn equipment. Some I had gone through when we first brought them over. 3 were sealed with tape that I had put on them myself and apparently never opened. We opened all three. The first two were books, mostly. Old paperback novels with yellowed pages, some old magazines, a few prayer books. The third was the one. It was full of papers, mostly nothing significant at first. Old utility bills, grocery receipts from decades ago, a few government documents, school records for me and Kenneth from the 1960s. Marcus held up a report card of mine and laughed when he saw the grade in gym class. I told him to put it down. And then, near the bottom of the box, in a small envelope sealed with a dried-out sticker, I found a letter. It was handwritten. The paper was thin and fragile, the kind of paper people used decades ago when paper was expensive enough to treat carefully. The handwriting was not my father's. It was neater, more formal, the kind of handwriting that spoke of a different era entirely. I carried it to the kitchen under the light. Marcus stood behind me looking over my shoulder. The letter was dated in the autumn of 1953, and it was addressed to my father by name. I read it slowly. I had to read some parts twice because the handwriting was difficult in places, but what it said was clear enough. The letter was from a man, an older man from the tone of it, someone writing to my father with warmth and a certain formal gratitude. He thanked my father for something. He used the phrase, an act of genuine decency that I will carry with me. He said that he wanted my father to have something in return, something meaningful, because what my father had done for him deserved more than words. He did not specify what my father had done, but the gratitude in those sentences was not small. It was the gratitude of someone who felt they had been given something back that they had almost lost entirely. At the bottom of the letter was a postscript. It said simply, "Please wear it. It was made to be worn." I set the letter down on the table. Marcus said, "What does that mean? What did he do?" I said, "I do not know." Marcus said, "Was he like a hero or something?" I said, "I think he was just a decent man, but sometimes that is its own kind of heroism." Pause. Have you ever felt that way? I would love to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was more remarkable than you realized? Just share a thought below. I read every one. I called my brother Kenneth that night. It was late, close to 10, and I knew he might be asleep or just getting back from wherever he and his wife had been for dinner, but I called anyway. Kenneth answered, sounding surprised and a little cautious, the way he always sounds when I call late. He said, "Ray, is everything okay?" I said, "Is Marcus there with you? On the phone or anywhere?" Kenneth said, "No, he is with you. Why?" I said, "Because I need to tell you something, and I am not ready to tell Marcus yet. I need your help thinking through it first." I told Kenneth everything. The watch, Harold Thomas Bellamy, the number, and the letter. Kenneth was quiet in a way that was very unlike him. Kenneth is usually the talker between us, the one who fills silence with commentary. But that night, he was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Dad always had that watch." I said, "I know." He said, "I never thought twice about it." I said, "Neither did I." He said, "Ray, what are you going to do?" That was the question. What was I going to do? The easy answer was obvious. Get it authenticated. Get it formally appraised. Decide what to do from there, simple enough as a sequence of events. But the real question, the one underneath that one, was bigger. What did this mean for the family? What did it mean for my father's memory? What did it mean for Marcus, who had called it junk and thrown it in a trash bag? And what did it mean for me? A 68-year-old man who had worn something of significant value every day of his adult life without knowing it, never insuring it, never protecting it beyond the care one naturally takes with a loved object. Kenneth said, "You should not tell Marcus yet." I said, "Why not?" Kenneth was quiet again. Then he said, "Because I know my son and I love him. But he is 26 and he has never learned to separate the price of something from the worth of it. If you tell him now that watch stops being Grandpa's watch, it becomes a number, and I am not ready for that. I do not think you are either." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Pause. The next few days were strange. Marcus left the following morning, his apartment ready again, and the house went quiet. Dora came home 2 days later, and the house filled up again in the way it does when she is in it, with sounds and movement and the smell of whatever she is cooking and the presence that 41 years of living with someone leaves in every room. Dora looked at the letter. She held it very carefully by the edges, the way you hold something you know is old and significant. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at me. She said, "Your father saved someone." I said, "That is what it sounds like." She said, "In 1953, he was what, 19, 20?" I said, "He would have been 20. She said, "And someone gave him a watch because of it. A real watch. And he wore it every day for 60 years without ever telling anyone what it was." I said, "That was him." Dora looked at me. Her eyes were soft, and I could see she was feeling something she was not going to say out loud, which is also something you learn to read after 4 decades together. Finally, she said, "He was a humble man." I said, "The most humble man I ever knew." She said, "He would not want this to become about money, Ray." I said, "No, he would not." She said, "But it is about money now, whether he would want it to or not, and you have to make some decisions." She was right again. Pause. I made an appointment with Thomas Bellamy for the full authentication process. He connected me with a formal auction house specialist who came to the house and spent several hours with the watch and the letter together. The letter, it turned out, was significant on its own, not valuable in a monetary sense, but valuable as provenance. In the world of serious watch collecting, provenance means the documented history of an object, where it came from, who owned it, why it changed hands. Provenance can be the difference between a watch that sells for one number and a watch that sells for a number that takes your breath away. The specialist's name was Caroline. She was in her 40s, precise and professional, with a way of looking at things that made you feel like she was seeing the object and the history inside it at the same time. She examined the watch with every tool she had. She read the letter carefully, took photographs of it, asked me numerous questions about my father. After about 3 hours, she sat down with me at the kitchen table. She said, "Mr. Raymond, I have to be straightforward with you. This watch is genuine. The authentication is as clear as anything I have seen in years of doing this. And the letter provides something that we rarely have access to, a direct connection between the object and a human story. In the auction world, that matters enormously." She said, "I cannot give you a final number today. The formal process takes time. But I can tell you that my informal estimate is at the high end of what Thomas suggested to you, and possibly beyond it. Watches from this period, this manufacturer, with provenance this clear and personal, are among the most sought after by serious collectors right now." She said, "You should also know that you have options. You could auction it. You could sell it privately. You could donate it to a museum and receive a significant tax benefit, or you could keep it. Any of those decisions would be legitimate, but you should make them knowing the full picture." I said, "How long until I have the full picture?" She said, 6 to 8 weeks for the formal appraisal and documentation. Then we can discuss next steps. She left. I sat with Dora at the table. Neither of us said anything for a while. Finally, Dora said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I do not know yet. I need to think." She nodded. She got up and put the kettle on. That is what Dora does when thinking is required. She makes tea. Pause. In the days that followed, I found myself doing something I had not done in years. I was looking through old photographs. I have boxes of them, printed photographs from decades before everything went digital, and I went through them slowly over several evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I was looking at my father. Not for any specific reason, just looking, just trying to see him again, trying to see him the way a person sees someone they have lost, which is differently than they saw them when they were living. When they are living, you see all of it, the ordinary and the extraordinary mixed together and inseparable. After they are gone, you start to see the shape of who the why were more clearly, like you can only see the whole outline of a mountain when you step far enough back. I found a photograph from a company picnic, 1961, based on the date someone had written on the back in pencil. My father was standing at a picnic table with his colleagues, laughing at something outside the frame. He was 30 years old in that photograph. He looked young in a way that surprised me, which always happens when you see your parents young. And there on his wrist, just visible, was the watch. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Then I found another one. He was at my parents' anniversary party, the 10th anniversary, which would have been 1964. Standing next to my mother, who was beautiful and smiling in a way that makes you understand instantly why my father loved her. His arm around her shoulders, the watch on his wrist. And another, my first day of school, 1966. He is crouched down next to me, his hand on my shoulder, looking at me with that expression fathers get when they are trying to be steady for their child while feeling everything on the inside. the watch on his wrist. It was always there. This thing of extraordinary value, worn every day, treated like a companion and not a treasure. I thought about what that said about him, about what kind of person lives like that. And then I thought about something else. Pause. I thought about the man who gave him the watch, the man who wrote the letter in 1953. I thought about what my father had done, this act of genuine decency, whatever it was that had earned such gratitude. I would never know exactly. My father never said. The letter hinted but did not spell it out. But whoever that man was, wherever his story had begun and ended, he had seen something in my father worth honoring, worth marking. And my father had accepted the gift, had worn it, had made it part of his daily life without making it a statement, without making it a performance. He just wore it, the way he wore everything, without pretense, without announcement, with quiet dignity. I want you to hear that, because it matters for what comes next. Marcus called me about a week after he had gone home. He called to check in, which surprised me a little, because Marcus is not always consistent about calling. He asked how I was doing. He asked about Dora. He mentioned that he had been thinking about what I said at dinner, about how worn things are not the same as worthless things. He said, "I keep thinking about that, Uncle Ray. I do not know why." I said, "Good, think about it some more." He laughed, then he said, "Hey, did you ever get that watch fixed?" I said, "It is being looked at." He said, "Cool, I hope it still works." I said, "I think it will be all right." After we hung up, I sat there for a minute with the phone in my hand, and I made a decision, not about the money or the auction or any of that, about Marcus, about what I was going to do when the time came. Pause. 6 weeks went by. Not fast, not slow. Just 6 weeks of regular life, of morning coffee and evening news and walks around the block and dinner with Dora and calls with Kenneth and visits from our children and grandchildren. Regular life. During that time, I thought a lot and talked a little. I talked to our pastor one Sunday after service, not about the watch specifically, but about the question of how you decide what to do with something that is not just yours, that is connected to more people than just you. He said something I liked. He said that the question of ownership is almost always simpler than the question of stewardship. Anyone can own something. Very few people think carefully about what they are supposed to do with it. I thought about that a lot. Caroline called me on a Thursday morning. She said the formal appraisal was complete, and she would like to come by and present the findings in person. She came that Friday. She brought documents, a formal appraisal letter with signatures and seals, pages of technical documentation about the movement and the case and the provenance. She sat down with me and Dora at the kitchen table. She laid the formal appraisal number in front of me on a printed page. Dora made a sound I had never heard her make before, a soft, quiet sound, like something had just landed gently on her chest. I looked at the number for a long moment. Then I looked up at Caroline. I said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "I recommend auction. The collector interest in this specific piece will be significant. With the provenance document, the letter from 1953, I believe we will see competitive bidding. I believe the final hammer price will be at or above the appraisal estimate." She said, "But that is my professional recommendation. What you decide is entirely your own." Dora and I looked at each other. She nodded just slightly. We had already had the conversations. We had already sat with it for 6 weeks. We already knew what we were going to do, or at least most of it. I said to Caroline, "How long does the auction process take to arrange?" She said, "For a piece like this, at a major house, we would be looking at about 4 months from consignment to sale." I said, "Then let us start." Pause. But before we get to the auction, I need to tell you what happened with Marcus, because that is the part of the story that surprised even me. About a month after Caroline's visit, when things were in motion with the auction house and the formal documentation and all of it, I called Marcus and asked if he wanted to come for dinner. He said yes right away, which I appreciated. He came on a Saturday. Dora made a proper dinner, roast chicken the way she has always made it, which is the kind of meal that makes a house smell like home no matter what is going on in it. Marcus arrived looking a little nervous, which was odd. Usually he was relaxed and easy. After dinner, sitting at the table with coffee, I told him. I told him all of it, the repair shop, Thomas Bellamy, Caroline, the letter, the appraisal, all of it. I kept my voice steady and simple. I did not make it dramatic. I just told him the way I would tell anyone a significant piece of information, clearly, completely, without excess. When I finished, Marcus was quiet. He had both hands wrapped around his coffee cup and he was staring at the table. His jaw was tight. I could see him processing. Then he looked up at me, and his eyes were wet. He said, "Uncle Ray, I almost threw it away." I said, "I know." He said, "It was in a trash bag. I put your father's watch in a trash bag." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I am so sorry." I said, "I know you are, and I believe you." He said, "But sorry is not enough. I almost threw away something that was everything." I said, "Here is what I want you to hear. You did not know. That is true. But there is a question worth sitting with. Why did you not know? Not about the watch. Nobody expected you to know about the watch. But why did you not know that some old things have value not because of what they cost, but because of who touched them and what they meant?" Marcus was quiet. I said, "That is not meant to hurt you. It is meant to make you think. Because if you had grown up understanding that, you never would have looked at your great uncle's watch and seen junk. You would have looked at it and seen something to ask about." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You are right." I said, "I know I am. But being right about that is not as important to me as what comes next." He looked at me. I said, "The watch is going to be auctioned. The money is going to be significant, and I want you to know exactly where some of it is going." I told him that Dora and I had decided to set aside a portion for our children and grandchildren. A portion for charitable giving, specifically to a scholarship fund we were establishing in my father's name, for young people from working families who needed help getting an education. And a smaller portion, not symbolic but real enough to matter, for Marcus. He shook his head immediately. He said, "No, you do not have to do that." I said, "I know I do not have to. That is why I am choosing to." He said, "But I almost threw it away." I said, "Yes, and that is something you will carry with you, and it will teach you something, and that is actually worth more than money. But I am not going to punish you for what you did not know. What I am going to do is make sure that what you receive comes with something attached to it." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The condition of what I am setting aside for you is that you use part of it to do something in your grandfather's name. Your great-uncle Kenneth Sr.'s name. I do not care what. Start a small fund, volunteer somewhere, give to something that helps working people. Do something that honors the man who wore that watch for 60 years without ever making a show of it. That is the condition." Marcus was very still. Then he said very quietly, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can." He wiped his eyes. He looked embarrassed for a second, and then he stopped looking embarrassed, which told me something good about him. He let the emotion be what it was. He did not hide it. He said, "Uncle Ray, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." He said, "Were you angry at me when you found out what it was worth?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "There was a moment, yes, a low heat in my chest, but it passed quickly because I know who you are. You are not a careless person at heart. You are a person who has not yet been taught to see the world a certain way, and that is fixable." He said, "You sound like him, like how you describe your dad." That took me by surprise. I sat with it for a second. I said, "That might be the kindest thing you have ever said to me, Marcus." Pause. The auction took place on a Tuesday morning, 4 months later. Dora and I were not in the room. Caroline had connected us with a PH. One line to listen, and we sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where all of this had started, holding hands across the table. I'm not going to tell you the final number because some things feel too private for that. But I will tell you that when the hammer came down, Dora squeezed my hand so hard my knuckles went white. And she was laughing and crying at the same time, which I have only seen her do a handful of times in 41 years. I sat there with the phone held between us and I thought about my father. I thought about him at 20 years old doing something decent for a stranger. I thought about him putting on that watch every morning for 60 years. I thought about him setting it on the nightstand at the end. I thought about the letter. It was made to be worn. He wore it well, and now it was going to someone who would wear it just as well because people who pay that much for a watch do not hide it away. They wear it. I thought that would make my father smile. After the call ended, Dora and I sat at the table for a long time not saying much. The coffee went cold. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Dora said, "What now?" I said, "Now we do what we said we would do." She said, "The scholarship fund." I said, "In his name. Your father-in-law's name, Raymond Sr., working people's kids who need a hand. She said he would argue with us for doing it. I said yes. He would say it was too much, that we did not need to, that it was our money and we should keep it. She smiled, she said, and then he would say thank you. I said yes, quietly when he thought no one was listening. Pause. Marcus came by a few weeks later to tell me something. He had done research, he said, on his own, no prompting from me. He had found a community organization in his city that helped workers displaced by factory closures, the exact kind of situation my father had faced when his factory shut down in the 1980s. Marcus had made a donation, a real one, not a symbolic amount, and he had signed up to volunteer on weekends. He told me this sitting at the kitchen table, in the same chair he had sat in when he had the trash bag in his hand. He said, I know it does not undo what happened. I said, there is nothing to undo. What happened taught something worth knowing. He said, I keep thinking about him, your dad, wearing that watch every day, not telling anyone. I said, what do you think about when you think about that? He said, I think about how different that is from how I was raised, not in a bad way about Dad, just. We were always encouraged to show things, show success, show achievement. Everything is a post, everything is something to share, and your dad just wore a thing worth a fortune and never mentioned it. I said, he found his value somewhere that was not visible to anyone else. Marcus nodded slowly. He said, I want to learn how to do that. I said, then you are already learning. Pause. What would you have done in this situation? I would genuinely love to know. There is no right answer, just your truth. Leave a thought in the comments. Now let me tell you the part of this story that I have been holding until the end. The part that still makes me sit quietly when I think about it. After the auction was settled and the scholarship fund was established and the paperwork was done, Caroline reached out to me one more time. She said that the collector who purchased the watch had asked, through the auction house, if there was any way to know more about the story behind the provenance. Not for any commercial reason, just because they wanted to know. Caroline asked if I was comfortable sharing any of it. I said yes. I authorized her to share the letter and the broad outline of what we knew about my father, the factory years, the general shape of his life. About a month later, the collector sent a personal note through Caroline. It was a short note, handwritten. It said that they were honored to have the watch and intended to wear it. It said that knowing the story made it mean more than the mechanism alone. It said that my grandfather, referring to my father, sounded like the kind of person the world needs more of. And at the bottom, in a footnote of sorts, the collector mentioned something that stopped me cold. They said their own research into the specific serial number had turned up a historical reference to the original gifting of a watch of this type in 1953, in connection with a workplace incident in a particular region. They said the incident involved a young worker who intervened when an older man had a medical emergency, acting quickly and calmly when others hesitated. The older man survived because of that intervention. He was a man of significant means, and he was profoundly grateful. The note did not say my father's name. The historical record was not that specific, but the year was right, the geography was right, the watch was right. My father, at 20 years old, had saved a man's life, and he had never said a word about it. Not once, not to my mother, not to Kenneth or me, not ever. He had just gone back to work the next day, and the day after that, and the 30 years of days after that. And every morning he had put on the watch the man gave him, and he had gone out into the world and done his job and raised his family and been exactly who he was. A decent man, a quiet man, a man who understood without anyone telling him that some things do not need to be said out loud to be real. Pause. I am going to wind down now, and I want to speak to you directly for a few minutes, because that is what I have been building to, really. Not the auction, not the money, not even the letter or the news about what my father did. What I have been building to is this. We live in a time when everything has to be visible, everything has to be announced. We post our meals and our travels and our achievements. We share our opinions and our milestones and our grief. I am not saying that is wrong. I am not that old and out of touch. I understand why people do it. Connection matters, community matters, being seen matters. But there is something that my father knew that I think we are losing, slowly, generation by generation. He knew that what you carry in your chest, the things you have done and the choices you have made and the values you live by, those things do not lose their power if you do not announce them. They gain power. They settle down deep in you, and they become something that other people feel in your presence without knowing exactly what they are feeling. My father wore that watch for 60 years. He never told me what it was, but I knew, without knowing the story, that it mattered to him. I knew it because of the way he held it, the way he wound it, the way he set it down carefully at the end of each day. I knew it because the things a person treats with quiet care are always the things that have shaped them in ways that go beyond language. My nephew Marcus looked at that watch and saw junk. And I do not blame him for that, because he was seeing what he had been taught to see: surfaces and prices and visible markers of worth. He had not yet been taught to look at the quiet things, at the worn things, at the things that show their age because they have been loved into that condition. He is learning now. I can see it in him. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is quiet and gradual, the way real change always is. And I think that is worth more to me, honestly, than any number that a hammer brought down in an auction room. Pause. Marcus called me last week, just to talk. He called on a Tuesday morning, which is the least likely time for a 26-year-old to call his uncle, and he called just to talk. We talked about his volunteering. We talked about a book he had picked up, a biography of someone he had come across in his research into the workers' organization. We talked about his father, my brother Kenneth, who is slowly coming around to some of the conversations he should have had with Marcus years ago. And near the end of the call, Marcus said something. He said, "Uncle Ray, do you think about him every day, your dad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you think about?" I said, "Different things. Some days I think about things he taught me. Some days I think about things I wish I had asked him. Some days I just think about his hands, the way his hands looked." Marcus said, "The watch is gone now. Do you miss having it?" I had been waiting for someone to ask me that. I sat with it for a second. I said, "The watch was never really mine to keep. I understand that now. It came from a moment of grace, a young man doing the right thing in a difficult situation, and it passed through 60 years of daily life, and then it passed through me, and now it is somewhere else being appreciated by someone who knows exactly what they have. That is a good life for a watch." I said, "But I did take something from it before it went. I took the photograph of my father wearing it at the company picnic. I had it enlarged and framed. It is on my desk now, and that is enough, more than enough." Marcus was quiet for a second. Then he said, "That is a real answer, Uncle Ray." I said, "Your great-grandfather was a real man. The least I can do is give him real answers." Pause. If this story said something to you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Not because of the watch, not because of the money, but because of what my father knew that we sometimes forget. That the most valuable things we carry are not always the ones with a price on them. The scholarship fund in my father's name gave out its first awards last spring. 6 young people from working families going to study things they care about, things that will let them build lives they are proud of. We did not put my father's face anywhere or his name in lights. We put it quietly on a small page in a document that went out to the Rasai. Pints, just his name and 2 lines. A factory worker, a father, a man who did the right thing when it mattered. One of the recipients sent a thank you note, a handwritten one. She said she came from a family where her father worked 3 jobs and her mother cleaned houses, and no one in her family had ever gone to college, and she had felt alone in the process until this. I read that note at the kitchen table with my coffee. I thought about my father's hands, his watch, the worn leather strap, the cream-colored face with black numbers. He would have read that note and been embarrassed by it. He would have looked away and cleared his throat and said something about how it was nothing, how anyone would have done the same. The way he always handled gratitude, by deflecting it gently and with grace. But I think somewhere, if there is a somewhere, he was not embarrassed. I think he was proud. Not of the money or the watch or the auction. Proud that something that started with a decent choice at 20 years old was still making ripples at 80-something years in the future. That is what I think. Pause. I want to close by saying something simple. Your family's history holds things you do not know yet. In old boxes, in worn objects, in choices made before you were born, in quiet moments that no one photographed or posted or announced. There are stories in your family that are waiting to be asked about, to be uncovered, to be honored. And the people who lived those stories, they were ordinary in all the ways that matter and extraordinary in ways that were never fully visible. Ask while there is still time to ask. Look at the worn things, the beaten-up things, The things that have been on the nightstand so long that you stopped seeing them. There is history in those things, and sometimes the history is worth something that goes beyond any number a room full of collectors can arrive at. Treat the things around you with the curiosity they deserve. Because when you write off something as junk without looking closer, you might be writing off a story. And the stories are always the most valuable part. My father knew that. He could not have articulated it in those terms. He was not a philosophical man in the speaking sense. But he knew it in his bones the way some people know things. He wore a piece of history every day. He kept it safe by making it ordinary. He kept it close by making it part of his routine. And when he left this world, he left it to me. Not because it was valuable, because he knew I would take care of it. Because he knew I would understand, even if I never knew the full story, that it was something to be held carefully. I tried to hold it carefully, for 17 years, and now it is somewhere else being held carefully. And in between it went through a trash bag and a repair shop and a consultation room and an auction house and a letter from 1953 that smelled faintly of something I could not name. And here we are. Pause. Until next time, take care of your people. And remember, your voice matters, and the quiet, worn things in your life might matter more than you think. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope something in this story landed where you needed it to land. I hope you go home tonight, or maybe you are already home, and you look at something you have stopped seeing, and you pick it up and you ask about it, or you just hold it for a minute and let it remind you who you come from. That is enough. That is more than enough. Take care. Important note, this story is a work of fiction. It is created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.